The sound of a gunshot tore through the dusty air of Cherry Creek, Colorado, in the summer of 1878, turning every head on the bustling Main Street toward the First National Bank. Margaret Blackwell stood on the wooden steps, her father's Winchester repeating rifle steady in her hands, smoke still curling from the barrel as she faced down three masked men who had moments before attempted to flee with the bank's money. "Next one goes between your eyes," she called out, her voice carrying over the sudden silence that had fallen across the street. "Drop the bags and put your hands where I can see them." The men hesitated, calculating their odds against the slender woman in her dust-stained riding skirt, her auburn hair escaping from beneath a practical hat. What they saw in her eyes must have convinced them, for two immediately lowered their canvas sacks of money to the ground. The third, however, made a fatal miscalculation. His hand twitched toward his holster, and Margaret fired again without hesitation. The man crumpled to the boardwalk, his gun clattering unfired beside him. The other two robbers raised their hands higher, genuine fear replacing bravado. Sheriff Thomas appeared from the saloon across the street, huffing as he hurried toward the scene, his deputies following in his wake. "Miss Blackwell," he called, frustration evident in his voice. "This is the second time this month you've taken matters into your own hands." Margaret didn't lower her rifle. "And it's the second time this month your deputies were nowhere to be found when trouble came calling, Sheriff." The townsfolk who had scattered at the first gunshot now began to emerge from doorways and from behind barrels and crates, watching the confrontation with interest. Margaret Blackwell was something of a local legend in Cherry Creek, the 26-year-old daughter of the late banker Harold Blackwell, who had taken over her father's business after his passing 3 years prior. Despite the murmurs of disapproval from the town's more traditional citizens, she had proven herself a shrewd businesswoman and, evidently, quite capable of defending her father's legacy. Sheriff Thomas motioned for his deputies to take the surviving bank robbers into custody. "One of these days, Miss Blackwell, you're going to get yourself killed playing the hero." Margaret finally lowered her rifle, but her posture remained rigid. "I'm not playing anything, Sheriff. I'm protecting what's mine." A low whistle from the edge of the gathered crowd drew her attention. A tall man leaned against a hitching post, watching the proceedings with interest. Unlike most men in town, he wasn't dressed in the simple clothes of a farmer or shopkeeper. His attire spoke of long days on the trail, well-worn leather chaps over dark trousers, a dusty coat over a faded blue shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his features. The holster on his hip held a Colt revolver that looked as though it had seen frequent use. "Impressive shooting, madam," he said, his voice carrying a hint of a southern drawl. Margaret regarded him coolly. Another drifter, she surmised. Cherry Creek had seen an influx of them since the rumors of silver strikes in the nearby mountains had begun circulating. "I wasn't aiming to impress," she replied, turning away dismissively to speak with the sheriff about the attempted robbery. "The bank is closed for the remainder of the day," Margaret announced to the small crowd that had gathered. "Anyone with urgent business can return tomorrow morning." As the crowd dispersed, Margaret handed the rifle to her assistant, William, who had emerged pale-faced from inside the bank. "See that the doors are locked and secure, William. Then go home to your family. I'm sure this excitement was more than enough for one day." The young man nodded, still visibly shaken. "Yes, Miss Blackwell, are you certain you're all right?" She offered him a reassuring smile. "Perfectly fine. Go on now." As William disappeared back into the bank, Margaret became aware that the stranger was still watching her. She straightened her spine, turned, and walked directly toward him. "Is there something I can help you with, Mr. Isaak O'Malley?" he replied, pushing away from the hitching post and removing his hat in a gesture of courtesy to reveal thick dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his shirt. His face was tanned and weathered by the elements, but his eyes were a striking blue that contrasted with his otherwise rugged appearance. Margaret guessed him to be in his early 30s, and I was just admiring your handling of that situation. Not many men could have done better. There was something in his tone that wasn't the usual condescension she received from men when they discovered a woman running a bank. Nevertheless, she kept her guard up. I find that a steady hand and clear purpose are generally more effective than bluster and bravado, Mr. O'Malley. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have matters to attend to. Of course. He placed his hat back on his head. Though I'd be careful walking home alone today. Those men might have friends waiting nearby. Margaret bristled at the suggestion that she needed a warning. I've been walking these streets alone since before you arrived in town, Mr. O'Malley. I need no man's protection. A slight smile crossed his face, touching the corners of his eyes with crinkles that spoke of frequent laughter. Then allow me to stand beside you, Miss Blackwell. These streets are safer with folks like you on them. The unexpected response caught her off guard, and Margaret found herself momentarily speechless. Most men in her experience would have either been offended by her declaration or insisted on offering their protection regardless of her wishes. This stranger's reply suggested something altogether different. Respect, perhaps. You're new to Cherry Creek, she said finally, more a statement than a question. Arrived yesterday, he confirmed. Looking for work. What kind of work? She eyed his holster meaningfully. The honest kind, he answered without hesitation. I've punched cattle for most of my life. Worked as a trail boss the last few years, bringing herds up from Texas, looking to settle somewhere a bit more permanent now. Margaret studied him for a moment longer. There was something about him she couldn't quite place, a quiet confidence that didn't cross the line into arrogance. Cherry Creek isn't known for its cattle operations, she said. Most folks here are either in mining or support businesses for the mines. I'm adaptable, he replied. And from what I just witnessed, this town could use a few more people willing to stand their ground. She couldn't argue with that assessment. Cherry Creek had grown rapidly in the past 2 years, bringing with it the inevitable problems of a boomtown drunkenness, gambling disputes, and increasingly robberies. Well, Mr. O'Malley, I wish you luck in your search for employment. Good day. She nodded and turned to walk away. Miss Blackwell, he called after her, causing her to pause and look back. That offer to walk beside you rather than in front of you stands, should you ever want the company. Margaret found herself smiling despite her usual reserve. I'll keep that in mind, Mr. O'Malley. For reasons she didn't care to examine too closely, Margaret found herself thinking about Isaak O'Malley as she worked in her office that afternoon. There had been something different about him, a quality she couldn't quite define, but that had left an impression nonetheless. William knocked timidly on her office door around 4 o'clock. Miss Blackwell, I've secured everything as you asked. Will there be anything else before I leave? No, thank you, William. Go home to Martha and the children. I'm just finishing these ledger entries. Are you certain you don't want me to wait and walk you home? He asked, concern evident in his voice. Margaret shook her head. That's very kind, but unnecessary. Your house is in the opposite direction from mine. I'll be perfectly fine. After William left, Margaret continued working until the late afternoon sun cast long shadows through her office window. Finally, she closed the ledger, locked it in the safe alongside the day's deposits, and gathered her things. The town was quieter now as she stepped onto the street. Most shops were closing for the day, their owners heading home for dinner. Margaret walked briskly, her hand never straying far from the small derringer she kept in her pocket. The sheriff might think her paranoid, but 3 years of managing the bank alone had taught her caution. She was halfway home when she sensed rather than heard someone following her. Turning casually as if to admire a storefront display, she scanned the street behind her. 3 men were about 50 yards back, walking with purpose. One of them she recognized as a regular at the saloon, who had tried to borrow money from the bank several times and been denied due to his gambling debts. Margaret quickened her pace slightly, turning onto a side street that would lead to her home. The footsteps behind her accelerated as well. She was considering whether to confront them or make a run for it when a familiar figure emerged from the alley ahead. "Evening, Miss Blackwell," Isaak O'Malley greeted her, tipping his hat. His casual posture couldn't hide the alertness in his eyes as they flicked past her to the men following. "Mr. O'Malley," she acknowledged with a nod, unsurprised to find that she was relieved to see him. "Thought I might find you heading home about now," he said conversationally, falling into step beside her. "Mind if I walk with you? I'm still learning my way around town." Before she could respond, one of the men behind them called out, "Hey, Blackwell, hold up there. We got business to discuss." Margaret turned, Isaak matching her movement, positioning himself not in front of her but at her side, just as he had promised. "I have no business with you, Mr. Jenkins," Margaret replied firmly. "If you wish to discuss alone, come to the bank during business hours tomorrow." Jenkins and his 2 companions stopped a few paces away. "That's not the kind of business I'm talking about. You see, my friend Darrell here was cousins with the fella you shot today. The man who tried to rob my bank and then drew on me," Margaret clarified, her voice steady despite the tension coiling in her stomach. "Don't much care about the details," Jenkins slurred, clearly having spent the afternoon drinking. "What matters is you killed him, and now there's a debt to be paid." Isaak shifted slightly, his stance casual but his hand resting near his holster. "Gentlemen," he said, his drawl more pronounced. "It seems to me that any man who tries to rob a bank and then draws on someone has made his own choice about how his story ends." "And who the hell are you?" demanded the taller of Jenkins's companions. "Just a fellow who doesn't like to see 3 men threatening a lady," Isaak replied, his tone pleasant but his eyes hard. Jenkins laughed, an ugly sound. "Lady, that's rich. Everyone knows she's nothing but a stubborn bitch playing at being a banker." Margaret's hand slipped into her pocket, fingers closing around her derringer. "I've asked you politely to leave, Mr. Jenkins. I won't ask again." The situation might have deteriorated further if not for the timely arrival of Deputy Wilson on his evening rounds. "Everything all right here?" he called, approaching with his hand on his gun belt. Jenkins glared at Margaret but backed away. "We were just having a friendly chat, weren't we, Miss Blackwell?" "It's over now," Margaret replied coldly. "Good evening, Deputy." The 3 men slunk away, Jenkins muttering threats under his breath that the deputy either didn't hear or chose to ignore. "You need an escort home, Miss Blackwell?" Deputy Wilson asked. "No, thank you, Deputy. Mr. O'Malley is accompanying me." The deputy nodded, eyeing Isaak with curiosity before continuing on his rounds. Margaret and Isaak resumed walking, neither speaking until they had turned onto the quieter residential street where her house stood, a modest but well-maintained 2-story structure with a small garden in front. "Thank you for your assistance," Margaret said as they reached her gate, "though I could have handled the situation." "I don't doubt it," Isaak replied with a smile, "but even the most capable person occasionally benefits from having someone at their side." Margaret studied him for a moment. "Why did you happen to be on that street just now, Mr. O'Malley?" "Were you following me?" "Not following," he corrected. "Watching out. There's a difference. After this morning's excitement, I thought there might be those in town who took exception to your actions." and appointed yourself my guardian." There was an edge to her voice. "Not at all," he said calmly. "I merely positioned myself where I could keep an eye on things and step in if needed. As it happened, I was needed." Margaret wanted to argue but couldn't deny the truth of his statement. "Well, in any case, I appreciate your intervention. Good evening, Mr. O'Malley." "Good evening, Miss Blackwell." He tipped his hat again. "I hope our paths cross again under more pleasant circumstances." As she watched him walk away, Margaret couldn't help but feel curious about this man who seemed to understand the difference between protection and partnership, a distinction most men in her experience failed to grasp. The next morning, Margaret arrived at the bank earlier than usual, letting herself in through the back entrance. She had work to catch up on after yesterday's disruption, and she preferred the quiet of the early morning hours. She was surprised, therefore, to hear a knock at the front door around 7 o'clock, a full hour before opening time. Cautiously approaching, she peered through the curtained window and was startled to see Isaak O'Malley standing on the boardwalk, hat in hand. "Good morning, Mr. O'Malley," she greeted him, opening the door just wide enough to speak through. "The bank doesn't open until 8. "I'm not here for banking business, Miss Blackwell," he replied. "I wanted to warn you that Jenkins and his friends were making some troubling statements at the saloon last night after you left. They're planning something, though they were too drunk to be specific." Margaret frowned. "I appreciate the warning, but as I said yesterday, you need no man's protection," he finished for her. "I remember. I'm not offering protection, just information. What you do with it is entirely your choice." She studied him for a moment, then opened the door wider. "Would you like to come in for coffee while you share this information?" His smile was warm. "That would be much appreciated." In the small office behind the teller's counter, Margaret poured coffee from the pot she'd already brewed for herself. Isaak took the cup gratefully, warming his hands around it before taking a sip. "This is good," he commented. "Better than what they serve at the hotel." "My father insisted on good coffee," she replied. "It was one of his few indulgences." She sat at her desk, gesturing for him to take the chair opposite. "Now, what exactly did you hear?" "Jenkins was boasting that he knew where you kept the real money, not just what's in the safe, but something about a hidden vault. He claimed he'd been inside the bank after hours once when your father was still alive and saw it." Margaret's fingers tightened around her cup. "That's impossible. The only people who know about the vault are myself, William, and the bank's board of directors." "Is there any truth to what he's saying? Is there a hidden vault?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. My father had it built when the bank was first constructed. It's behind a false wall in the cellar, but Jenkins couldn't possibly know about it unless someone told him," Isaak finished. "But who would?" She trailed off, a suspicion forming. 2 months ago, one of our board members, Henry Caldwell, resigned rather suddenly. He claimed he was moving east for his health, but there were rumors he had gambling debts. Would he have had reason to betray your confidence? If he owed enough money to the wrong people, perhaps. She set down her cup and stood. "I need to check the vault immediately." "I'll come with you," Isaak offered, rising as well. Margaret hesitated only briefly before nodding. If what she suspected was true, she might indeed need assistance. She led him through a door behind her office to a narrow staircase that descended into the bank cellar, a cool, dry space used mainly for storage. At the far end, she moved aside several crates, revealing what appeared to be a solid stone wall. "My father was clever," she explained, pressing against a particular stone. With a soft click, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a small chamber containing a substantial iron safe. "That's impressive craftsmanship," Isaak commented as Margaret knelt before the safe and began to work the combination. The door swung open with a metallic groan, and Margaret's eyes widened. "It's still here," she breathed, relief evident in her voice. Inside were stacks of currency and several leather pouches that clinked with the unmistakable sound of gold coins. "How much is in there?" Isaak asked quietly. "Nearly $40,000, she replied, closing the safe again. "The bank's emergency reserves, plus deposits from several of the larger mining operations in the area. If Jenkins knows about this, it explains why he's so interested in your bank specifically." Margaret nodded grimly, standing and dusting off her skirt. "And why the robbery attempt yesterday might not be the last." She glanced at him. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Mr. O'Malley." "Isaak, please," he said. "And you're welcome, Miss Blackwell." "Margaret," she offered in return, surprising herself. She rarely invited such familiarity from men she had just met, but something about Isaak O'Malley inspired trust. As they climbed back up to the main floor, Isaak asked, "Will you inform the sheriff?" "Yes, though I'm not confident in his ability to prevent a determined attempt." She sighed, checking her pocket watch. "William will be here soon, and we open in half an hour." "I'll leave you to your work then," Isaak said, moving toward the door. "But if I may make a suggestion, perhaps moving that money to a safer location might be prudent, at least temporarily." Margaret considered this. "Perhaps, but where? The stagecoach only comes through twice a week, and the next one isn't due until Friday." "I wasn't thinking of the stagecoach," Isaak replied. "Too obvious, especially if Jenkins has friends watching the bank. I was thinking of a more creative solution." Despite her natural caution, Margaret found herself intrigued. "I'm listening." "Let me look into some options," he said. "In the meantime, be extra vigilant. Jenkins strikes me as the type to act sooner rather than later." After Isaak left, Margaret tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept returning to the hidden vault and the threat Jenkins posed. By midday, she had made her decision. She would need to move the money, but how and where remained questions without clear answers. William knocked on her office door shortly after noon. "Miss Blackwell, there's a gentleman here to see you. He says it's about a job." Curious, Margaret followed William to the front of the bank where Isaak stood, hat in hand, looking every bit the respectable job applicant. "Mr. O'Malley," she greeted him formally, aware of William and the few customers present. "Please come into my office." Once the door closed behind them, she raised an eyebrow. "A job application, a cover story," he explained quietly. "I've been asking around town about Jenkins. He's been buying drinks freely at the saloon, boasting about coming into money soon. And I saw two of his friends watching the bank from across the street this morning." Margaret frowned. "You believe they're planning to rob the bank? Tonight, if I had to guess." The sheriff's deputy mentioned that most of the law enforcement will be escorting a prisoner to Denver today, leaving only the sheriff and one deputy in town. "That's troubling news," Margaret admitted. "Have you considered a solution to our transportation problem?" Isaak nodded. "I have. There's a cattle drive passing about 5 miles west of town tomorrow. The trail boss is an old friend of mine. If we can get the money to him, he can ensure it reaches the bank in Denver safely." "And how do you propose we get it there without being noticed?" A smile touched his lips. "I was thinking we might go for a ride in the countryside. A banker and her prospective new employee discussing terms of employment away from curious ears." "A ride," she repeated, considering the idea. "That might work. We could take the money in saddlebags, not all at once, but in portions over a day or two." "Exactly what I was thinking," Isaak agreed. "But first, we need to make sure the bank is secure tonight." Margaret thought for a moment. "I sometimes sleep here when there's a large deposit," she said. "There's a cot in the back room. If Jenkins is planning something for tonight, perhaps that would be wise. I'll join you, Isaak offered immediately, then added at her raised eyebrow, not in the back room, of course, but I can keep watch from outside. That won't be necessary, she began. I know it's not necessary, he interrupted gently, but it would be prudent. 2 sets of eyes are better than 1. She couldn't argue with that logic. Very well. Return after closing hours, 7 o'clock. Come to the back entrance. I'll be there, he promised, rising to leave. At the door, he paused. For the benefit of any watchers, perhaps you should tell me I don't have the job. Jenkins might get suspicious if he thinks I've been hired so quickly. Margaret couldn't help but smile at his attention to detail. Mr. O'Malley, she said loudly enough to carry beyond the office, I'm afraid your qualifications don't meet our requirements. Good day, sir. He played along beautifully, his expression shifting to one of disappointment. I understand, Miss Blackwell. Thank you for your time. He placed his hat on his head and left with just the right amount of dejection in his stride. The afternoon passed slowly, each customer who entered the bank subjecting Margaret to heightened scrutiny. Was this person working with Jenkins? Were they gathering information about the bank's layout or security? By closing time, her nerves were stretched thin. She sent William home early, assuring him she would finish the day's accounting herself. Once alone, she retrieved her father's shotgun from beneath the counter and placed it within easy reach of her desk. At precisely 7 o'clock, a soft knock sounded at the back door. Margaret approached cautiously, shotgun in hand. Who is it? She called. Isaak O'Malley, came the reply. She unlocked the door to find him standing there with a small bundle under one arm and his rifle in the other hand. Any sign of Jenkins or his men? Nothing obvious, he replied, stepping inside. But that doesn't mean they're not watching. Margaret locked the door behind him. What's in the bundle? Dinner, he said with a smile, unwrapping bread, cheese, and cold chicken. I thought you might be hungry. The thoughtful gesture touched her. Thank you, I hadn't even considered food. They ate in her office, keeping their voices low as they discussed the plan for the following day. Margaret would close the bank at noon, citing personal business. They would then ride out separately, meeting at a predetermined location before continuing to the rendezvous with the cattle drive. What about tonight? Margaret asked as they finished their simple meal. Do you really think Jenkins will try something? I think it's likely, Isaak replied seriously. The timing is too perfect with most of the law out of town. If I were planning to rob this bank, tonight would be the night I'd choose. Margaret nodded, reaching for her father's shotgun. Then we should be prepared. Isaak looked at the weapon with approval. You know how to use that. My father taught me to shoot when I was 12, she confirmed. Said a woman alone in the world needed to know how to defend herself. Wise man, your father. He was, she agreed, a hint of sadness creeping into her voice. He would have liked you, I think. He always valued straightforwardness and courage. High praise, Isaak said softly. I'm sorry I never had the chance to meet him. They lapsed into comfortable silence as the evening deepened outside. Margaret showed Isaak the layout of the bank, pointing out possible entry points that would need watching. They agreed to take turns keeping watch, with Margaret first while Isaak rested on a chair they positioned near the rear exit. The hours passed slowly. Margaret's watch showed just past midnight when she heard a soft scraping sound from the direction of the side window. She moved silently to where Isaak dozed and touched his shoulder lightly. He was instantly alert, reaching for his gun before he was fully awake. Margaret put a finger to her lips and pointed toward the window. He nodded, rising silently to his feet. They positioned themselves on either side of the window, listening. The scraping came again, followed by the unmistakable sound of glass being carefully cut. Someone was trying to remove a pane to unlock the window from inside. Isaak caught Margaret's eye and motioned for her to stay back while he moved toward the front of the bank. She shook her head firmly, gesturing that she would cover this window while he checked the others. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded and moved away. The glass pane fell inward with a muffled thump as the intruder caught it before it could shatter on the floor. A moment later, a hand appeared, reaching through to unlock the window latch. Margaret waited until the window began to slide upward before she cocked the shotgun loudly. The sound froze the intruder in place. "I wouldn't come any further if I were you," she said calmly. "This shotgun is loaded with enough buckshot to ensure you won't be robbing anyone ever again." There was a muttered curse from outside, and then the window was shoved fully open as the intruder decided to take his chances. Margaret was about to fire when another gunshot rang out, not from her weapon but from somewhere near the front of the bank. The others. She realized, momentarily distracted. The distraction was all the intruder needed. He launched himself through the window, knocking into Margaret and sending them both crashing to the floor. The shotgun discharged harmlessly into the ceiling as they fell. Margaret found herself pinned beneath a heavy body, the stench of whiskey and sweat overwhelming. It was Jenkins, his face twisted with rage and desperation. "Where's the money, you bitch?" he snarled, one hand closing around her throat. "Tell me how to open the vault." Margaret clawed at his hand, struggling to breathe. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision as his grip tightened. Suddenly, Jenkins was wrenched away from her, his weight disappearing as Isaak hauled him bodily across the room and slammed him into the wall. "That's no way to talk to a lady," Isaak growled, delivering a solid punch that sent Jenkins slumping to the floor, unconscious. Margaret gasped for air, her hand going to her bruised throat as Isaak knelt beside her. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, his eyes scanning her for injuries. "I'm all right," she managed, her voice hoarse. "The others," one ran when I fired, "the others tied up by the front door." He helped her to her feet, his touch gentle but firm. "We need to get the sheriff." They secured Jenkins with a length of rope from the storage room and dragged him to join his accomplice by the front door. Isaak then went to alert the sheriff, while Margaret kept watch over their prisoners. Sheriff Thomas arrived looking disheveled and irritated at being awakened, but his expression changed to one of shock when he saw the two bound men. "Miss Blackwell, what in tarnation happened here?" Margaret explained briefly while Isaak stood quietly at her side. The sheriff looked between them with suspicion. "And what exactly were you doing in the bank after hours, Mr. O'Malley?" "I hired him as a night guard," Margaret interjected smoothly. "After yesterday's robbery attempt, it seemed prudent." The sheriff didn't look entirely convinced, but was too pleased with the capture of the would-be robbers to press the issue. "Well, I suppose I should thank you both. These men have been causing trouble in my town for months." After the prisoners were taken away and the sheriff departed with a promise to return in the morning for formal statements, Margaret and Isaak were left alone in the damaged bank. "We should board up that window," Isaak said, already looking for materials. "There are tools and some planks in the storage room," Margaret directed him. As he worked, she found herself watching his movements, the careful precision of his hands, the strength in his shoulders as he hammered the boards into place. "Why are you helping me?" she asked suddenly, the question that had been nagging at her since their first meeting finally finding voice. Isaak paused in his work, turning to face her. In the dim lamplight, his expression was thoughtful. "When I first came to Cherry Creek, I was just passing through, looking for a place that might need what I have to offer." He set down the hammer. "Then I saw you facing down those bank robbers, standing your ground when most men would have fled. It reminded me of something my father used to say, that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right despite the fear. He took a step closer. And then, I heard how you've been running this bank since your father died, despite the opposition from those who think a woman has no place in business. That kind of determination, it's rare. Margaret felt an unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest at his words. "So you admire my stubbornness?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light. "I admire your courage, your intelligence, and yes, your independence," he replied seriously. "And I thought perhaps such a woman might appreciate having someone who understands the difference between protecting and partnering." The simple honesty of his answer caught her off guard. For years, she had kept men at a distance, seeing in their offers of assistance only attempts to control her or take what her father had built. But Isaak O'Malley seemed different. He had proven himself willing to stand beside her rather than in front of her, just as he had promised. "I think," she said carefully, "that I might appreciate such a partnership, Mr. O'Malley." His smile was warm in the lamplight. "I'm glad to hear it, Miss Blackwell. Now, perhaps we should try to get some rest. Tomorrow promises to be a busy day." They spent what remained of the night in uneasy vigilance, taking turns to sleep in brief shifts. By morning, Margaret felt exhausted but resolute. The plan to move the money needed to proceed without delay. After giving their statements to Sheriff Thomas and overseeing temporary repairs to the bank, Margaret posted a notice announcing the bank would close at noon for the remainder of the day. At 11:30, she began the process of removing money from the hidden vault, carefully packing it into saddlebags that could be concealed beneath a riding coat. William arrived just as she finished, looking concerned. "Miss Blackwell, I heard about what happened last night. Are you all right?" "I'm fine, William," she assured him. "Just a bit tired. The sheriff has Jenkins and one of his accomplices in custody, and the bank's funds are secure." "Thank goodness," he said with evident relief. "Is there anything I can do to help?" "Yes, actually," Margaret replied, making a decision. "I need to attend to some personal business this afternoon. Could you handle any inquiries that might come in my absence?" "Of course," William agreed readily. "Will you be back tomorrow?" "Yes, I shouldn't be gone more than a few hours." She picked up her riding coat, carefully concealing the bulge of the saddlebags. "If anyone asks, I've gone to visit my mother's grave at the old churchyard." It was a believable excuse. Margaret made the journey to the small cemetery outside town every few months to place flowers on her parents' graves. As planned, Margaret and Isaak left town separately. She rode west along the main road, while he departed in a northerly direction, circling around to meet her at an abandoned line shack about 3 miles outside of Cherry Creek. The April day was cool but pleasant, the mountains visible in the distance still capped with snow while the valley bloomed with the first wildflowers of spring. Under different circumstances, Margaret might have enjoyed the ride and the rare opportunity to escape the confines of the bank and the town's watchful eyes. She reached the line shack first, dismounting and leading her horse to a small stream nearby to drink. The structure itself was weathered, but still sound, a simple one-room cabin built for cowboys working the range to take shelter in during storms. Isaak arrived 20 minutes later, approaching cautiously until he confirmed she was alone. "Any trouble?" he asked, swinging down from his saddle. "None," Margaret replied. "You clear all the way." He led his horse to the stream beside hers. "We should rest here for a bit, let the horses recover before we continue. It's another hour's ride to where we'll meet the cattle drive." Inside the cabin, they shared a simple meal of bread and dried beef that Isaak had packed. Margaret found herself studying him as they ate, noting the easy confidence with which he moved, the alertness in his eyes that never fully disappeared, even in moments of apparent relaxation. "Tell me more about yourself," she requested suddenly. "You know a great deal about me, but I know very little about you beyond your skill with horses and guns." Isaak leaned back against the rough wall of the cabin. "Not much to tell that would interest a lady like yourself," he said with a slight smile. "I was born in Virginia, but my family moved west after the war. My father ran cattle in Texas until he died 5 years ago. Mother followed him a year later, influenza. I've been on my own since then, working cattle drives mostly." "No family of your own?" Margaret asked, then flushed slightly at the personal nature of the question. "Never found the right woman," he replied simply. "Or perhaps never stayed in one place long enough to look properly." His eyes met hers briefly. "Until now, perhaps." The implication hung in the air between them, neither acknowledging it directly but both aware of its presence. Margaret found herself both unsettled and intrigued by the possibility his words suggested. "We should continue," she said finally, rising to her feet. "I'd like to return to town before nightfall if possible." The remainder of the journey passed in comfortable silence. As they rode, Margaret found herself increasingly aware of Isaak's presence beside her, the straight line of his back in the saddle, the sure way he handled his horse over the uneven terrain, the occasional glances he cast her way when he thought she wasn't looking. They reached the arranged meeting point, a stand of cottonwood trees along a creek, in the early afternoon. As promised, the cattle drive was there, nearly 2,000 head of Texas longhorns stretching across the valley floor, attended by a dozen cowboys. A tall, weathered man rode out to meet them, his face breaking into a grin when he recognized Isaak. "O'Malley, I was beginning to think you weren't coming." "Said I'd be here, didn't I, Marcus?" Isaak replied, dismounting to shake the man's hand. "Marcus, this is Miss Margaret Blackwell of the First National Bank of Cherry Creek. Margaret, this is Marcus Daniels, the finest trail boss in Texas." "Miss Blackwell," Marcus greeted her with a respectful touch to his hat brim. "Isaak tells me you have a delivery that needs to reach Denver safely." "That's correct, Mr. Daniels," Margaret confirmed, retrieving the saddlebags. "These contain bank funds that need to be deposited with the First National Bank of Denver. I can provide a letter of authorization." Marcus nodded. "Won't be necessary. Any friend of Isaac's is trustworthy in my book. We'll have your money in Denver by the end of the week, safe and sound." The transaction was completed quickly, with Margaret providing detailed instructions for the Denver bank. As they prepared to depart, Marcus drew Isaak aside for a private word, while Margaret adjusted her saddle straps. "Your friend seems reliable," she commented as they rode away, the cattle drive already disappearing behind them. "Marcus is one of the best men I know," Isaak confirmed. "Honest to a fault and tough as old leather. Your money couldn't be in safer hands. What did he say to you before we left?" Margaret asked, curiosity getting the better of her. Isaac's cheeks colored slightly. "He, commented that you were a fine-looking woman and asked if I was planning to settle down in Cherry Creek." "And what did you tell him?" She kept her tone carefully neutral, though her heart had begun to beat a little faster. "I said I hadn't decided yet," Isaak replied, looking straight ahead, "but that Cherry Creek had certain attractions that made it worth considering." Margaret couldn't help the smile that tugged at her lips. "I see." They were halfway back to town when dark clouds began gathering over the mountains, the spring weather changing rapidly as it often did in Colorado. A cool wind picked up, bringing with it the scent of rain. "We should seek shelter," Isaak advised, eyeing the approaching storm. "That looks like it could be severe." Margaret glanced at the sky with concern. "The line shack, too far now. There's a cave in those hills. He pointed to a rocky outcropping about half a mile east of their position. Used it once during a hunting trip. It should offer adequate protection. They reached the cave just as the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. It was larger than it appeared from a distance, extending back into the hillside far enough that they could bring the horses inside as well. "You've been in these parts before?" Margaret asked as they settled in, spreading her coat on a flat rock to sit upon. "A few years ago," Isaak confirmed, gathering wood that previous visitors had left in the cave. "Spent a season working for the Double R Ranch before signing on with a cattle drive headed to Montana." He arranged the wood and struck a match, the small fire casting flickering shadows on the cave walls. Outside, the storm intensified, rain falling in sheets and occasional lightning illuminating the landscape in stark flashes. The temperature dropped noticeably and Margaret shivered despite her warm riding clothes. "Here," Isaak said, noticing her discomfort. He removed his coat and draped it around her shoulders. "Can't have you catching a chill." "Thank you," she murmured, pulling the coat closer. It carried his scent leather, wood smoke, and something uniquely him. "But won't you be cold?" "I've weathered worse," he assured her with a smile, settling beside her near the fire. "This reminds me of nights on the trail finding whatever shelter was available when storms blew in, making do with what you had." "It sounds like a hard life," Margaret observed. "It has its moments," he acknowledged, "but there's a freedom to it that I've always valued. The open sky, new horizons, making your own decisions without anyone looking over your shoulder." "I understand that desire for independence," Margaret said softly. "After my father died, everyone expected me to sell the bank or worse, marry someone who would take over its management. They couldn't conceive of a woman running such an establishment. But you proved them wrong." She smiled, gazing into the fire. "I did. It wasn't easy. The first year, several customers withdrew their accounts rather than do business with a mere girl, as one put it. But gradually, as the bank continued to operate successfully, most came back. Some even apologized." "Your father would be proud," Isaak said with quiet conviction. "It takes courage to stand against convention that way." "It wasn't only courage," Margaret admitted. "There was a healthy dose of stubbornness involved as well. I refused to let anyone take from me what my father had built, what he had been training me to manage since I was old enough to count money." The firelight played across her features, highlighting the determination in her expression. Isaak found himself studying her profile, the straight line of her nose, the gentle curve of her lips, the way her auburn hair caught golden highlights from the flames. "What are you looking at?" she asked, catching his gaze. "You," he replied honestly. "You're quite remarkable, Margaret Blackwell." The directness of his answer caught her off guard, and she felt a flush rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire's warmth. "I'm merely doing what needs to be done," she deflected, uncomfortable with the praise. "There's nothing mere about it," Isaak countered. "Most people do what's expected of them, follow the well-worn paths others have laid out. Few have the courage to forge their own way." The storm continued outside, rain drumming against the rocky entrance of the cave, occasional thunder punctuating their conversation. Inside, however, Margaret found herself relaxing in Isaak's company, the tension of the past 2 days gradually easing from her shoulders. They talked for hours as the storm raged about their childhoods, their experiences, their hopes for the future. Isaak spoke of his years on the trail, the lands he had seen from Texas to Montana, the people he had met. Margaret shared stories of growing up as a banker's daughter, learning the business from the ground up, and her struggles to maintain her father's legacy after his death. "I've never spoken so freely with anyone before," Margaret confessed as the storm finally began to abate, the rain tapering to a gentle patter. "Especially not a man I've known for such a short time." "Sometimes," Isaak said thoughtfully, "it's easier to open up to someone who hasn't known you your whole life, someone who sees you as you are now, not as they expect you to be." Margaret considered this. "Perhaps you're right. In Cherry Creek, I'm always Harold Blackwell's daughter, the woman trying to do a man's job. People see what they expect to see." "And what do you see when you look at me?" Isaak asked, his voice quiet but intent. She met his gaze steadily. "I see a man who has honored his word to stand beside me rather than in front of me, who has helped me protect what's mine without trying to take it from me." She paused, then added softly, "A man unlike any I've known before." The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibility. Isaac's eyes, illuminated by the dying fire, held a warmth that had nothing to do with the flames. "Margaret," he began, then stopped, as if uncertain how to continue. She waited, her heart beating a rapid rhythm against her ribs. "I came to Cherry Creek looking for a place to belong," he said finally. "Somewhere I might put down roots after years of drifting. I didn't expect to find someone who would make me want to stay." Before she could respond, he reached out slowly, giving her ample time to withdraw if she wished, and brushed a strand of hair back from her face. His fingers lingered against her cheek, warm and calloused from years of hard work. Margaret knew she should pull away, maintain the proper distance between them. They were alone in a cave miles from town. It was hardly a situation a respectable woman should find herself in, let alone one who ran a bank and was responsible for the financial security of an entire community. Yet she couldn't bring herself to move away from his touch. Instead, she found herself leaning slightly toward him, drawn by something deeper than propriety or reason. "Isaak," she whispered, his name feeling right on her lips. He closed the distance between them slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw. When his lips met hers, the kiss was gentle, questioning. Margaret had been kissed before awkward courtship rituals with the sons of her father's business associates, but never like this. Never with this sense of rightness of coming home. When they finally parted, Isaak rested his forehead against hers. "I should apologize," he murmured, "but I can't bring myself to regret it." "Nor can I," Margaret admitted, surprising herself with her honesty, "though this is most improper." A smile touched his lips. "You've never struck me as a woman overly concerned with propriety." She laughed softly. "Perhaps not, but I do have a reputation to consider." The bank is important," he acknowledged, drawing back slightly to look into her eyes. "Your father's legacy matters." "But so does your happiness, Margaret." The simple statement struck her with unexpected force. How long had it been since she had considered her own happiness? Since her father's death, she had focused entirely on preserving the bank, proving herself capable, and earning the respect of the community. Personal joy had seemed a luxury she couldn't afford. "The storm has passed," she observed, reluctantly pulling back. "We should return to town before people begin to worry." Isaak nodded, understanding her need to retreat from the intensity of the moment. "Of course." They doused the fire and prepared to depart, the air between them charged with new awareness. As Margaret mounted her horse, she found herself wondering what this unexpected connection might mean for her carefully ordered life. The ride back to Cherry Creek was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts. The late afternoon sun broke through the clouds, turning the rain-washed landscape into a gleaming tapestry of greens and golds. They approached town from the east, taking a roundabout route to avoid unnecessary attention. "I'll enter first," Margaret suggested as they paused at the edge of town. "It would be better if we weren't seen returning together after my supposed visit to the cemetery." Isaak nodded. "Wise thinking. I'll wait 15 minutes, then follow." She hesitated, suddenly reluctant to leave him. "Will I see you tomorrow, if you wish it?" he replied, his eyes searching hers. "I do," she confirmed. "Come to the bank around closing time. We should discuss arrangements for the money when it returns from Denver." They both knew it was a pretense, but neither acknowledged it directly. "Until tomorrow, then," Isaak said, tipping his hat. Margaret rode into town with her thoughts in turmoil. Everything was changing so quickly. Just 3 days ago, her life had been ordered, predictable if somewhat lonely. Now, she found herself in the midst of a situation she could never have anticipated, with feelings she had never expected to experience. As she stabled her horse behind her house, Margaret made a decision. She would not run from these feelings, whatever they might be. She had faced down bank robbers and town gossips. Surely she could face her own heart with equal courage. The next morning, Cherry Creek was abuzz with news of the attempted bank robbery and the capture of Jenkins and his accomplice. Margaret found herself the subject of curious stares and whispered conversations as she made her way to the bank. William greeted her with evident relief when she arrived. "Miss Blackwell, I'm so glad you're here. There have been so many people asking about the robbery, and Mr. Richardson from the Mining Association stopped by with concerns about their deposits." "Everything is secure," she assured him. "Please inform Mr. Richardson that the bank's funds are safe and that operations will continue as normal." The day passed in a flurry of activity, reassuring nervous depositors, dealing with paperwork from the sheriff's office regarding the robbery attempt, and conducting normal business. Margaret found her thoughts straying frequently to Isaak and the moment they had shared in the cave, but she forced herself to focus on the tasks at hand. As closing time approached, she became increasingly aware of the passing minutes. When the front door opened at 5 minutes to 5, her heart leapt in her chest only to sink again, when she saw it was merely Mrs. Hollister coming to withdraw funds for her weekly shopping. After the last customer left and William began the closing procedures, Margaret retreated to her office, telling herself that Isaac's absence meant nothing. Perhaps he had business elsewhere. Perhaps he had reconsidered the wisdom of becoming involved with a woman in her position. She was gathering her things to leave when a knock sounded at the back door. William looked up in surprise. "Are you expecting someone, Miss Blackwell?" "It may be Sheriff Thomas with follow-up questions about the robbery," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "I'll see to it, William. You can finish up here and go home." She opened the back door to find Isaak standing there, hat in hand. "Sorry I'm late," he said quietly. The sheriff had more questions about Jenkins and his gang. Relief washed through her. "Come in," she invited, stepping back to allow him entry. Once the door closed behind him, they stood facing each other in the narrow hallway, suddenly awkward where before there had been ease. "I thought perhaps you changed your mind," Margaret admitted, breaking the silence, "about seeing you." Isaak shook his head. "No. Though I did spend much of last night wondering if I'd overstepped yesterday." "You didn't," she assured him quickly. "Or if you did, I stepped with you willingly." A smile touched his lips at that. "I'm glad to hear it." William's voice called from the front of the bank. "Miss Blackwell, I've finished the closing procedures. Will there be anything else before I leave?" "No, thank you, William," she called back. "Have a pleasant evening." They waited until they heard the front door close and lock before continuing their conversation. "I received a telegram from the Denver bank this afternoon," Margaret said, leading the way to her office. "They confirmed that the cattle drive passed through Boulder yesterday and should reach Denver by tomorrow evening. Our funds will be secure." "That's good news," Isaak replied, following her. "Jenkins won't be causing any more trouble for a long while, according to the sheriff. They found evidence linking him to 2 other robberies in nearby towns. Margaret sat at her desk, gesturing for Isaak to take the chair opposite. So it seems our immediate concerns have been resolved. It does, he agreed, which leaves us to address other matters. She met his gaze steadily. What exactly are your intentions, Mr. O'Malley? You mentioned putting down roots in Cherry Creek. Was that merely a convenient explanation for your presence here or something more? It was the truth, he replied without hesitation. I've been looking for a place to settle, somewhere I might build a future. Cherry Creek seems as good a place as any, better than most, in fact. And does that future you envision include me? Margaret asked directly, surprising herself with her boldness. Isaak leaned forward, his expression serious. I would very much like it to, if you're amenable. But I understand your position here, the importance of your father's legacy, the need to maintain your independence. I wouldn't ask you to compromise either. What exactly are you proposing then? She pressed, needing clarity. For now, simply the opportunity to court you properly, get to know you better outside of crisis situations. A smile touched his lips. Though I admit our acquaintance so far has been rather illuminating in its own way. Margaret couldn't help but return his smile. Most courtships don't begin with foiling bank robberies and fleeing town with saddlebags full of money. We're hardly most people, Isaak pointed out. No, she agreed softly. We're not. She studied him for a moment longer, then made her decision. Very well, Mr. O'Malley. I would be amenable to a proper courtship, provided it doesn't interfere with my responsibilities to the bank. I wouldn't dream of it, he assured her. In fact, I've been thinking about how I might contribute to the security of your enterprise. The recent events have highlighted certain vulnerabilities that could be addressed. His practical approach, focusing on her concerns rather than his own interests, further convinced Margaret she was making the right choice. Did you have something specific in mind? Several things, actually, he replied. But perhaps we could discuss them over dinner. There's a restaurant at the hotel that I'm told serves an excellent steak. Are you asking me to dine with you this evening, Mr. O'Malley? Margaret asked, a teasing note entering her voice. I believe I am, Miss Blackwell, he confirmed, matching her tone. With your permission, of course. Permission granted, she said, rising from her desk. Though I should stop at my house first to freshen up. Would 7 o'clock at the hotel restaurant be acceptable? Perfect, Isaak agreed, standing as well. I'll escort you home. That won't be necessary, she began automatically, then paused, reconsidering. Actually, I would appreciate the company if you don't mind. His smile warmed her as surely as the sun. I'd be honored to walk beside you, Margaret, today and for as many days as you'll allow. The weeks that followed saw Cherry Creek abuzz with speculation about the relationship between the town's female banker and the newcomer Cowboy. Some disapproved, particularly the older matrons who had never quite reconciled themselves to a woman running the bank in the first place. Others were more supportive, especially those who had come to respect Margaret's business acumen and integrity over the years. For her part, Margaret found herself experiencing a happiness she hadn't known was possible. Isaak courted her with a respectful persistence that never crossed the line into possessiveness. He asked her opinions on matters both trivial and important, and more significantly, he listened to her answers. When the bank faced challenges, he offered suggestions without attempting to take control. When she achieved successes, he celebrated them without jealousy. 1 month after their first meeting, Margaret officially hired Isaak as the bank's security manager, a position she created specifically for his talents. He implemented several improvements to the bank's physical security, including better locks on all entrances, and a more secure method for transporting large sums of money. 2 months after their first meeting, On a warm evening in June, Isaak invited Margaret for a horseback ride to the spot where they had taken shelter during the spring storm. The cave had been transformed a picnic blanket spread on the flat stone where they had sat before, wildflowers arranged in crude clay pots, and lanterns providing a warm glow that outshone their earlier campfire. "How did you manage all this?" Margaret asked in wonder, turning a slow circle to take it all in. "I had some help from William," Isaak admitted. "He's quite fond of you, you know. Said it was about time you had some happiness in your life beyond ledger books and banknotes." Margaret laughed. "That sounds like William. He's been fussing over me like a mother hen since my father died." Isaak took her hands in his expression growing serious. "Margaret, these past months have been the happiest of my life. I came to Cherry Creek looking for a place to belong, but I found something far more precious, someone to belong with." Margaret's breath caught as he lowered himself to one knee, still holding her hands. "I know you value your independence, and I would never ask you to surrender it. What I'm proposing isn't protection, but partnership, standing beside each other through whatever life brings." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "Margaret Blackwell, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The ring inside the box was simple but elegant, a single diamond set in gold, flanked by two smaller sapphires that reminded her of Isaak's eyes. "It was my mother's," he explained softly. "One of the few things I've carried with me through all my travels, waiting for the right person to give it to." Tears filled Margaret's eyes, not of sadness but of overwhelming joy. "Yes," she whispered, then more firmly, "yes, Isaak O'Malley, I will marry you." He slid the ring onto her finger, then rose to his feet, drawing her into his arms. The kiss they shared was filled with promise of passion, of partnership, of a future built together rather than separately. Cherry Creek celebrated the wedding of Margaret Blackwell and Isaak O'Malley on a perfect September day in 1878. The ceremony, held in the town's small church, was attended by nearly everyone in the community. Even those who had initially disapproved of the match had come around after seeing the obvious happiness of the couple. Margaret wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered for the occasion, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a traditional veil. Isaak, for his part, looked more comfortable than anyone had ever seen him in a new suit purchased specifically for the day. William served as best man, beaming with pride as he handed over the rings. Mrs. Thompson, the widow who had been Margaret's neighbor and friend since childhood, stood as her matron of honor, dabbing at her eyes throughout the ceremony. "I need no man's protection," Margaret included in her vows, smiling up at Isaak, "but I welcome your partnership with all my heart." "Then I will stand beside you," Isaak replied, clasping her hands in his, "through all the joys and challenges life brings us, as your equal and your devoted husband." Their new home, a comfortable house on the edge of town with enough land for the horses Isaak loved, became a center of community life in Cherry Creek. The bank continued to thrive under Margaret's leadership, with Isaac's security measures making it one of the safest in Colorado territory. A year after their wedding, Margaret gave birth to a son they named Harold Isaak O'Malley, after both their fathers. 2 years later, a daughter joined the family, Elizabeth Margaret O'Malley, a spirited child who showed early signs of inheriting both her mother's determination and her father's easy charm. As Cherry Creek grew from a mining town into a proper city, the O'Malleys grew with it. The bank expanded, eventually opening branches in neighboring communities. Isaac's knowledge of cattle and horses led him to establish a successful livestock brokerage alongside his work at the bank. Through it all, they maintained the partnership they had promised each other on their wedding day. When decisions needed to be made, they made them together. When challenges arose, they faced them side by side. When triumphs came, they celebrated as equals. On their 10th anniversary, Isaak surprised Margaret with a return to the cave where he had proposed. Now accessible by a well-maintained trail, it had become a special place for them, somewhere they could escape the bustle of their growing family and prosperous businesses. "You ever regret it?" Isaak asked as they sat together watching the sunset paint the mountains in gold and crimson. "Marrying a drifting cowboy instead of a proper banker or businessman," Margaret laughed, leaning against his shoulder. "Not for a single moment. You've never tried to change me or control me. You've stood beside me through everything, just as you promised." "It wasn't a difficult promise to keep," he replied, wrapping his arm around her. "Standing beside you is exactly where I've always wanted to be." As the last light of day faded and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Margaret reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her here. From the young woman determined to preserve her father's legacy to the confident banker, wife, and mother she had become, it was a path she could never have foreseen. "What are you thinking about?" Isaak asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "About that day we met," she replied. "About how close I came to sending you on your way because I was too stubborn to accept help." "You weren't stubborn," he corrected gently. "You were strong. There's a difference." "Perhaps," she acknowledged. "But I've learned that true strength isn't found in standing alone, it's found in choosing carefully who you stand with." Isaak's kiss was as tender as the first they had shared in this very cave a decade earlier. "I'm honored to be your choice, Margaret O'Malley. And I'm grateful every day that you chose to stay in Cherry Creek," she whispered against his lips. "That you saw me as a partner rather than someone to protect." As they rode back to town in the gathering darkness, Margaret looked ahead to the lights of Cherry Creek, their home, their children, the life they had built together. What had begun with a bank robbery and an unexpected encounter had blossomed into a partnership that defied convention while honoring the best parts of tradition. In the years that followed, the story of Margaret Blackwell and Isaak O'Malley became something of a legend in Cherry Creek, how a determined woman banker and a drifting cowboy had found in each other not protection but partnership, not limitation but freedom. Their children and grandchildren would carry forward that legacy, the understanding that the strongest relationships are built not on dependence but on mutual respect, not on protection but on standing together through whatever life brings. And whenever young women in Cherry Creek faced doubts about their own capabilities or their right to forge their own paths, they would hear the story of Margaret Blackwell, who needed no man's protection, and Isaak O'Malley, who stood beside her anyway. As Cherry Creek grew into the 20th century, the bank that Margaret had fought so hard to preserve remained a cornerstone of the community, still bearing the Blackwell name alongside O'Malley in honor of its determined founder. The partnership that had begun with a defiant declaration and an unexpected response had become a foundation not just for a family but for a growing city's prosperity. Long after both Margaret and Isaak had passed on, leaving their legacy in the capable hands of children who had learned by example what true partnership meant, people in Cherry Creek would still point to the old bank building and tell newcomers, "That's where it all began, with a woman who needed no protection and a man wise enough to stand beside her instead." And in the archives of the bank, carefully preserved alongside the original ledgers and deeds, was a faded newspaper clipping from 1878. Reporting an attempted bank robbery foiled by the remarkable marksmanship of Miss Margaret Blackwell, the day when a determined banker and a drifting cowboy first crossed paths, forever changing the course of both their lives and the future of Cherry Creek itself.